July 21st, 2026. Two tunnel mouths cut into a granite ridge in the Zagros Mountains. Packed dirt and rubble sealing both of them from the outside, something like 600 meters of solid rock between the surface and whatever Iran has actually built underneath it, and a sitting president of the United States who already told the world out loud on live radio exactly what happens to that mountain next. We're going to take out Pickaxe Mountain. Tell the Iranians to get ready. Not a leak, not an anonymous defense official talking to a reporter on background. The President of the United States naming a nuclear target by name on the record and daring the other side to do something about it. That is the position the world is sitting in right now. But to understand how we got a moment like that, you need to back all the way up, because nothing about this week happened in a vacuum. And the further back you go, the more this starts to look less like an isolated threat and more like the final step of a chain that's been building for years. Start with the program itself, because the roots of this go back further than most coverage bothers to explain. In 2018, during Trump's first term, the United States walked away from the 2015 nuclear agreement that had capped Iran's enrichment activity in exchange for sanctions relief. Iran responded over the following years by doing exactly what critics of that withdrawal warned it would do, breaching those caps one by one and investing in enrichment capability far beyond what the original deal ever allowed. Iran spent most of the last decade quietly expanding its enrichment capacity past anything a civilian power program actually requires. Under the original 2015 nuclear agreement, Iran was capped at stockpiling barely 200 kilograms of uranium enriched to reactor-grade purity. By the time American and Israeli aircraft hit Iranian soil in June of last year, the country had accumulated over 440 kilograms, enriched all the way to 60%, one technical step below weapons grade, and had reduced what analysts call its breakout time. The window needed to convert existing stockpiles into enough weapons-grade material for an actual bomb to something government estimates once put at as little as a single week. Iran is the only country without a declared nuclear weapons program that has ever produced uranium at that enrichment level. That single fact is the entire reason this conflict exists. So in June 2025, the United States acted. Operation Midnight Hammer sent 7 B-2 Spirit bombers on the longest combat mission the airframe had flown since 2001, multiple aerial refuelings stitched across 2 oceans, ending with 14 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs dropped on 3 targets, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. It was the first time that weapon had ever been used in combat anywhere in the world. The declared goal wasn't to slow the program down, it was to end it. It didn't end it. It's not clear it was ever capable of ending it, because here's the detail almost nobody outside the non-proliferation community actually sat with at the time. Nobody, not the Pentagon, not the IAEA, has been able to verify what happened to that 440-kilogram stockpile since the strikes. International inspectors last physically confirmed its location and quantity in June of last year. Everything since then is estimate, satellite inference, and secondhand reporting. Iran suspended the working arrangement that gave inspectors any access at all just months later, formally telling the IAEA in a letter that the agreement was terminated. The world's nuclear watchdog has spent the better part of a year telling its board of governors, in increasingly blunt language, that it simply cannot account for material that could, in theory, still be sitting in a hardened tunnel complex somewhere in Iran, undamaged, waiting. Which brings us to the ridge 1.5 miles from the Natanz wreckage. Iran has been quietly excavating a site there since 2020. One, it insists, is nothing more than a centrifuge manufacturing facility. Inspectors have never once been allowed inside to confirm that. The IAEA's own reporting has pointed to a separate underground tunnel complex nearby, at Isfahan, as the suspected storage location for most of that vanished 60% stockpile, which only sharpens the question hanging over Pickaxe Mountain itself. Not just what's being built there, but whether it's connected to material the world has already lost track of once. Here's what we actually know about the site itself, in hard numbers rather than vague description. The complex sits inside a ridge that peaks at roughly 1,600 meters, spread across nearly a full square kilometer of mountainside in Isfahan province, about 220 kilometers south of Tehran. The core structures are reportedly buried under as much as 600 meters, close to 2,000 feet of granite. Compare that to Fordo, which sat under roughly 200 to 300 feet of rock and mountain when the GBU-57 hit it. Pickaxe is reported to be buried several times deeper than that. It survived Operation Midnight Hammer untouched. It survived again when a second war broke out on February 28th of this year, an opening exchange of American and Israeli strikes so overwhelming that it didn't just hit military infrastructure. It killed Iran's actual head of state, along with several of the men directly beneath him. Hold that thought, because we are coming back to it, and it is bigger than almost anyone covering this story casually seems to realize. First, the numbers as they stand today. The ceasefire that ended the February War required Iran to freeze all construction and reconstruction activity at its nuclear sites, while a longer settlement got negotiated, maintaining the status quo. On July 8th, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies published satellite analysis showing continued excavation work at Pickaxe Mountain in direct violation of that agreement. 6 days later, the Institute for Science and International Security followed with its own imagery, dated July 9th, showing the tunnel entrances covered over with fresh soil and rock, a hardening technique meant to blunt the effect of an airstrike on the entry points, alongside vehicle activity consistent with ongoing construction rather than a site standing idle. 2 independent analytical shops, 6 days apart, using different satellite passes, reaching the same conclusion. That is not a rumor. That is a pattern, and it's the kind of pattern that tends to precede exactly the sort of statement Trump made next. On July 13th, Trump sat down with radio host Hugh Hewitt and said the quiet part out loud. He confirmed that the United States has been watching the site closely through what he described as extensive overhead coverage, including Space Force assets, and that current imagery shows no visible activity at the moment. And then, in the same breath, he said Pickaxe is a possible target for what he called a nice, big, fat shot right through the front door, and that Americans would probably give it a shot relatively soon. When Hewitt pressed him on whether he'd demand IAEA inspectors get full access to the tunnels before signing any new agreement with Tehran to rule out what Hewitt framed as a doomsday machine buried in the rock, Trump didn't hedge. He said absolutely, and added that Iran currently has no working weapon because, in his words, every time intelligence detects something, the United States blows it up. Read that again, because it is doing more work than it looks like. That is not a threat aimed at deterring future construction. That is a president describing an ongoing campaign of preemptive strikes as the actual functioning non-proliferation policy of the United States government, replacing inspections and diplomacy with rolling airstrikes as the verification mechanism. Whether or not you think that's the right approach, it is a genuinely different doctrine than anything that came before it, and it tells you almost everything about what happens next if satellite imagery keeps showing activity at that ridge. Now here's where the story most casual coverage isn't connecting properly. Strikes against Iran did not stop after the February war ended in a ceasefire. They have continued in waves through the spring and into July, hitting command centers, air defense nodes, missile and drone launch sites, and coastal surveillance positions across the country, alongside an escalating maritime confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz, where Iranian forces and aligned proxies have repeatedly targeted commercial shipping and oil tankers attempting to transit the strait. The declared American military posture throughout has been consistent. Forces remain vigilant, focused, and ready to continue. So let's actually talk about what happens if Pickaxe gets hit, because this is where the hardware matters, and it deserves more than a passing mention. The weapon built for exactly this kind of target is the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound, 20-foot-long, precision-guided bomb capable of punching through roughly 200 feet of reinforced concrete before its fuse triggers detonation deep inside a structure rather than on the surface. It relies on nothing exotic to do that. Just mass, velocity, and a hardened steel casing built to survive its own impact long enough to reach the target before it goes off. The B-2 Spirit is the only aircraft in the world currently cleared to carry it operationally, and it can only carry 2 at a time, which is exactly why it took 7 bombers flying a 30-hour mission to deliver 14 of them to Fordo and Natanz in 2025. But 200 feet of concrete is not the same problem as nearly 2,000 feet of solid granite, and that gap is exactly the bet Iran made when it started digging at Pickaxe back in 2020. It watched what happened at Fordo. It studied the vent shafts the American strike package focused on, because ventilation is the unavoidable weakness of any deeply buried facility, no matter how much rock sits on top of it. Air has to get in. Power has to get in. Somewhere, a tunnel entrance has to exist for people and equipment to move through, which is exactly why the hardened backfilled entrances analysts keep flagging at Pickaxe matter as much as they do. Iran adapted to the last war. Whether that adaptation is enough to survive the next one is the actual open question sitting underneath this entire story. And the Pentagon itself doesn't seem fully convinced the current weapon is enough. On June 1st, the Air Force formally designated a successor to the MOP, the GBU, the 76.B, officially called the Next Generation Penetrator. It's actually lighter than the current bomb, expected to come in around 10 tons versus the MOP's 15, but engineered with better accuracy, holding to within a couple of meters even in GPS-degraded or GPS-denied environments, exactly the kind of electronic interference a determined adversary would try to throw at an incoming strike package. It's also being designed with an eye toward the next generation of stealth bombers coming into service, aircraft that would only be able to carry 1 MOP at a time instead of 2, making a lighter, smarter penetrator operationally necessary rather than optional. Translation: The weapon that hit Fordo is already considered the old generation, and the Air Force greenlit its replacement within a year of using it for the first time, specifically because facilities like Pickaxe Mountain exist. When your adversary's response to getting hit is to dig deeper, your response has to be a weapon that goes deeper still. That arms race, bombs against granite, granite against bombs, is happening in real time, right now, in this specific mountain. And it's worth knowing where the outer edge of that arms race actually sits. Separate from the conventional next-generation penetrator, the United States is also developing a nuclear-tipped deep penetrating weapon, an acknowledgement buried in defense planning documents that some sufficiently buried facilities may simply sit beyond what any conventional bomb, current or future, can guarantee destroying. Nobody in the current conflict is proposing to use that weapon on Iran, and there's no indication anyone is close to it. But the fact that the program exists at all tells you how seriously military planners take the possibility that a mountain like this one could out-engineer every conventional answer we currently have. Reporting from mid-July indicates the administration has also been moving additional aerial refueling tankers into the region. Tankers are the one piece of infrastructure you cannot fake. You don't stage a sustained stealth bomber campaign across that kind of distance without them. When the tankers move, that's not rhetoric. That's logistics, and logistics tell you what's actually being planned days before anyone announces it publicly. While all of this has been building in the Gulf, look at what happened this weekend on a completely different front, because the timing matters more than people are giving it credit for. On the night of July 19th, Russia launched one of the largest ballistic missile barrages of the entire war against Kiev, more than 40 missiles alongside well over 100 attack drones in a single overnight assault. Ukrainian air defenses intercepted a significant share of both, but at least one person was killed and more than a dozen wounded, as buildings across the capital took direct hits. Ukraine's government called it the largest ballistic barrage aimed at the capital since the invasion began, more than 4 years ago. That is happening in the same week the United States is signaling a potential strike on Iran's deepest nuclear facility, which means American strategic attention, air defense stockpiles, and diplomatic bandwidth are being pulled in genuinely different directions at the same moment, and that is not a coincidence anyone serious about this analysis can afford to ignore. Because here's the actual structural picture underneath the headlines. There are 3 separate kinds of pressure converging on decision makers in Washington at exactly the same time, and it's the convergence, not any single track alone, that makes this moment as volatile as it is. There's the financial track, and the numbers here are not abstract. Since the February war began, the Strait of Hormuz crisis has left at least 1 tugboat sunk, more than a dozen merchant ships damaged, 2 vessels captured, and a dozen seafarers killed or missing. Since July the 6th alone, at least 9 ships have come under attack, as Iran tries to force tankers into its own territorial waters rather than the middle of the strait, and maritime risk analysts have described the current security posture in Hormuz in the bluntest terms available to their industry, a worst-case scenario. Every one of those incidents moves the oil market. Brent crude jumped roughly 3% in a single session earlier this month on news of just 1 tanker attack. Roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil and a similar share of the world's liquefied natural gas moves through that strait on a normal day. A memorandum of understanding signed back on June 17th was supposed to guarantee safe passage, but Washington and Tehran still can't agree on which lanes count as safe, which is exactly the kind of ambiguity that gets a tanker set on fire. The United States has already launched 6 separate rounds of retaliatory airstrikes on Iranian missile batteries, drone operators, and gunboats specifically in response to the tanker campaign, on top of everything hitting Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Every attack narrows the margin the global economy has for absorbing a full closure of that strait, even a temporary one. There's the military track. Sustained operations against Iran, running in parallel with a European war that just produced its worst single night of missile fire on a capital city in years, alongside a broader web of American commitments that don't pause just because one theater is heating up. Ukraine's own defenses are stretched thin in exactly the way this conflict is stretching everyone thin. Officials there have pointed directly to a shortage of Patriot interceptor missiles, the primary defense against the kind of ballistic barrages Russia has now launched against Kiev on a near-weekly basis throughout July, as the reason more of those missiles are getting through than earlier in the war. And Ukraine isn't even unified behind a single political front while it's absorbing that pressure. Zelensky's recent dismissal of his defense minister as part of a broader cabinet reshuffle has sparked street protests at the same time Kiev is taking its worst missile fire in years, which is its own reminder that no country fighting a war this long stays politically frictionless the entire way through. Stretch any military thin enough across enough simultaneous fronts, in enough theaters with enough internal political strain layered on top, and even the best resourced force in the world starts making trade-offs it would rather not make. And then there's the psychological track, which is the one almost nobody talks about clearly enough, and it's actually the most important of the 3. Because here's the detail that changes how you should read everything else in this story. Iran is not just fighting this war with a damaged nuclear program, an unaccounted for uranium stockpile, and a depleted missile inventory. It is fighting this war without the man who ran the country for 36 years. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the second supreme leader of Iran and its head of state since 1989, was killed in the opening hours of the February 28th strikes, along with the chief of Iran's top national security body and the commander of its Revolutionary Guard. Read that again, slowly, because it is one of the most consequential facts of this entire conflict, and it rarely gets more than a passing mention in daily coverage. The single most powerful individual in the Islamic Republic, the man with constitutional authority over the armed forces and final say on questions of war and peace, is dead and has been dead since the opening days of this war. What replaced him is not reassuring if you're looking for stability. Within roughly a week of his father's death, Iran's assembly of experts, reportedly under direct pressure from the Revolutionary Guard, selected Khamenei's own son, Mojtaba, as the new supreme leader, a father-to-son succession that breaks with decades of precedent in a system explicitly built to avoid looking like a hereditary monarchy. There was reportedly at least one serious rival candidate discussed in the same window, a senior cleric with his own institutional base inside the assembly of experts, which tells you the succession wasn't as clean or as unanimous as the official announcement made it sound. Mojtaba was reportedly wounded in the same strike that killed his father, and by multiple independent accounts, he has barely appeared in public since taking the position, skipping even the funeral proceedings for members of his own family. Tens of thousands of mourners packed Tehran for a 6-day funeral for the late supreme leader, and the man who now holds his title wasn't among them. And here's a detail that connects the succession crisis directly back to the nuclear question at the center of this entire video. According to reporting citing senior Iranian sources, it was Mojtaba himself, in his new capacity, who issued the directive that Iran's enriched uranium stockpile should not be sent out of the country, directly complicating any negotiated deal that would require exactly that kind of transfer as a precondition for lifting sanctions or halting strikes. The man who hasn't been seen in public in weeks is reportedly still making the single decision that matters most to whether this war has an off-ramp. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Guard has burned through its own chain of command at a pace that would be remarkable in any conflict. Hossein Salami, the Guard's commander during the 2025 war, was killed that June. His successor, Mohammad Pakpour, lasted roughly 8 months before he too was killed in the February strikes that took out Khamenei. The man now running the Revolutionary Guard, Ahmad Vahidi, is a former founding commander of the Quds Force and a former defense minister and interior minister, widely described as a harder-line figure than either of the two men who held the job before him and didn't survive it. Alongside him sits a newly created wartime defense council, meant to institutionalize planning that used to run informally through the Supreme Leader's office, now headed on an acting basis by a former naval commander who represents the more doctrinal, strategic layer of a system trying to keep functioning without the man who used to sit at the top of it. So when you ask what Iran's actual retaliation plan looks like, you are not asking a simple question about one government's strategy. You are asking who, precisely, is making decisions inside a leadership structure that has lost its head of state, its top security official, and 2 consecutive military commanders in under a year, replaced by a barely seen cleric who apparently still controls the fate of the country's most sensitive strategic asset, and a hardliner who inherited a job with a documented mortality rate. That is not a system built for careful, centralized decision-making under pressure. Authority is fragmented across the surviving Guard command structure and a defense council that didn't exist 18 months ago. And the actual chain that would authorize or restrain a major retaliatory strike is far murkier to outside observers, and possibly to some insiders, than official statements suggest. Which brings us to the honest strategic assessment, the version that doesn't fit neatly into either government's talking points. Pickaxe Mountain may genuinely sit beyond what current American bunker busters can guarantee destroying in a single strike, which is precisely why the Air Force fast-tracked a heavier-hitting successor within a year of the weapon's combat debut. A decision to hit Pickaxe now, with the current generation MOP, is also implicitly a bet on a longer campaign rather than a single decisive blow like the one delivered at Fordo. The tanker movements reported in mid-July suggest the logistics for that kind of sustained operation are already being assembled. At the same time, the entity that would have to decide how to respond and how far to escalate that response is running through a chain of command that has been repeatedly decapitated over the past 13 months, which cuts 2 different ways. It could mean an Iranian response that's slower and more disorganized than in past crises, a government too consumed by its own succession crisis to mount a coherent counter. Or it could just as easily mean a response driven by field commanders and Guard elements operating with less centralized restraint than a fully intact leadership structure would normally provide. inside a country simultaneously watching its regional position erode and its own economy strangled by a contested strait. None of that resolves cleanly in the next news cycle. It's the kind of uncertainty that tends to persist for months, quietly shaping every decision made in Washington and Tehran long after this particular news cycle moves on. That is the structural risk that should actually keep serious analysts up at night, more than any single headline about a bomber or a bunker buster, not whether the United States has the hardware to hit Pickaxe Mountain. It almost certainly does, at least in the sense of being able to drop ordnance on the coordinates. The real uncertainty is what happens on the other side of that strike, inside a command structure this fractured, holding an unaccounted for stockpile of near weapons-grade material, where the answer to who authorizes the next move and who controls what's left of the program is no longer a single, predictable name. So we're left exactly where we started. A mountain in the Zagros range, its entrances sealed with fresh dirt, its depths unconfirmed by anyone outside Tehran, and a president who has already said out loud, on the record, that he's coming for it. Somewhere above the granite, the tankers keep moving into position, and a new bomb that didn't exist a year ago is already being built to go deeper than the one that struck Fordow. Somewhere beneath it, nobody outside a handful of intelligence analysts actually knows what's finished and what isn't, or what happened to 440 kilograms of material the world hasn't independently verified in over a year. And somewhere in Tehran, the man whose directive currently governs that stockpile's fate hasn't been seen in public in weeks.